So, hi everyone. In this lecture of ROS106, we will be going to study about ArUco markers. So, before starting them, let's understand with a basic problem. Let's say you have to write something on the robots in order to identify them. One of the solutions to this is like you assign numbers 1 to 9 on the robots and use some computer vision algorithm to identify them. But there is an issue with this. Let's say you assign number 6 to a robot and it gets flipped. Now, to the algorithm, it will be detected as number 9 and thus the robot is wrongly identified. To avoid this, we use something called ArUco markers. So before getting to know what ArUco markers actually are, let's see how they look like. So we can generate ArUco markers using the website. This website uses the exact same algorithm through which ArUco markers are generated. So as you can see, this is an ArUco marker. I can assign it some ID which I want. Let's say I assigned ID 50 to it, and accordingly the shade of the boxes will be changed. Now there is something called dictionary. These are the standard dictionaries as you can see. They are markers of various size dimensions in it, like this 6 cross 6, this 5 cross 5. These are dimensions, and accordingly the marker will be changed. Now let's understand what these dimensions, what these numbers actually represent. To understand this, we need to divide a ArUco marker into grid. So for to study now, let's take the example of a 6 cross 6 ArUco marker. Let's see what happens if I divide this ArUco markers into grid. So this is a grid view of the ArUco marker. First of all, I divided it into blocks. Now, if you count, you will see that it is a ArUco marker of 7 cross 7. But there is actually an offset layer that is added so that like during the detection we take some offsets to avoid errors. So this outside layer is usually removed during the detection, and as a result the marker is only the inside layer, which is a 6 cross 6 layer. Now these layer in the marker, the cells are either black or white. The white cell denote a set bit and the black cell denote a not set bit. Basically we are using binary system to represent something on marker. Now if a bit is set, it will be denoted by white. If it is not set, it will be denoted by black. So as you can see, in a 6 cross 6 ArUco marker, there will be 36 square. Now if you do simple calculation, for each bit we have an option of either setting it or not setting it. So accordingly, there should be 2 to the power 36 markers. Let's do this calculation. So if I open calculator, as you can see, this is a very large number, 2 to the power 36. But when I again go to that ArUco marker generator website and see, in this, the markers, the dictionary of the markers does not have a large size. There are very small number of markers in dictionary. So now this is done for a reason. Let's say I generate two markers in which they differ only by one square. But now when I will be going to identify this marker using some camera or using some another way, the set or the not set bit will always have some error. So accordingly, if two markers are very similar to each other, then there will be issue in identifying this. So the RUCO markers were developed by some researchers with a very precise algorithm such that any two RUCO markers are very different from each other. There is a term called Hamming distance, which we will study later, which we will get to know about later, which is basically used. And if the error margin between two ArUco markers are not less, then only we will say with guarantee that this is the actual identity of the robot. So what we'll do now is we know what an ArUco, we first understood what an ArUco markers is, and we realized why they are not such a large number of RUCO markers. Even though we can set we have 36 bit to set, still we don't have this much RUCO markers in dictionary. This is done so that distance or the like error between any two RUCO marker is very huge. Now you might be wondering, if we have such a large number of combinations, why there are not many RUCO markers in the dictionary. So to understand that, let's directly see how the RUCO markers look like. So as you can see, these are the RUCO markers for ID 1 to 12. When you will look to them closely, you will realize that any two RUCO markers are not at all close. Between any two RUCO markers, there is a large difference between the scores which are shaded and which are not shaded. This is done to ensure, like, even if there are some error of 1 or 2 bits, still the marker detected will be not, like, for example, if the error between two ArUco markers is not much, like two ArUco markers differ only by one square, then there can be some error detection and we may identify wrongly the we may identify a robot wrongly. So in order to avoid that, we have made ArUco markers. The ArUco markers are made in such a way that there is a large difference between any two ArUco markers. So during detection, even if it is off by 1 or 2 bits, then also we can say with confidence that our robot ID number is this, which we will identify through our algorithm. Okay, so now let's see the code through which we will be detecting our ArUco markers. So I have opened the file basically here. Now, first of all, we need to make the necessary imports. So we need to import CV2 or basically the computer vision. Now we also need the OpenCV. Now we need to import NumPy. NumPy is basically used there to handle matrices. OS is like optional, but I am using it here. Like I will be supplying the image path and then I will be annotating the results on that. Now once we have made the necessary imports, we define something called a ArUco class. Now in the init function of the ArUco class, first we have to give it marker size and it is a very important parameter. This marker size can be set either in our ArUco generator or the ArUco marker which we are using on our robot. There are two other very important things called camera matrix and distance coefficients. These are there in a real robot. Like if we are using real hardware, we need to provide the camera matrix of the camera we are using and distance coefficients accordingly. But these will not be required in our case as we will not be using a real robot here. Now there is a try except function basically used here. It is used to read the ArUco dictionary which are using. ArUco dictionary is what we saw in the ArUco generator also. Is the like it stores basically the dimension of the ArUco marker and what are the parameters. So as you can see, the ArUco dictionary here is the 606 ArUco dictionary, and you can see a number 250 here. These represent like different markers or like these are the different number of markers in this dictionary. And then we also have to import the desired ArUco parameters. There are some other thing also called adaptive threshold, win size, and all these. This we will understand later when we will be studying how these function internally work. Now let's get to the most important function of our code, that is the detect marker function. Now what it takes, it takes the image path as the input. Then using the cv2.imRead, it first reads that image. And if the image is none, then there is this warning message like could not load the image, and it provides the image path. Now, once we have this image path, we need to perform some operations to this image before we can pass it to the ArUco detector function. Like if we will pass it directly, there might be some errors in the ArUco tag detection. So what we do is we first convert that image to grayscale. Now this is basically done because in a grayscale image, like you can imagine like if in a grayscale image it is easy to identify contrast between a black and white square. So we convert our image to a grayscale image. Now comes the most important function of our code or the cv2.eruco detector function. Like basically it is an inbuilt function. It takes in two parameters, our eruco dictionary. As I have shown you, the eruco dictionary is our 606 dictionary and eruco parameters of that dictionary. Now it takes in these things and it gives output and give us three things in output. These three things are corners, IDs, and rejected. Now, as this name suggests, corners is basically a list of the corner coordinates for each detected marker. Like for example, I give an image which consists of 6 ArUco markers. So it will return me like 24 different corners, and these corners will be basically the cornering of like uh, you can say that these corners will be basically the corners of the bounding box of these 6 ArUco markers in the image. Next, there will be some IDs, or which is the array of the marker IDs, of which, like for example, there are different ArUco markers, and we can assign an ID as I have shown in the ArUco generator. So these IDs will be stored in an array in the order of the detection, like, and then there will be something called rejected. Now there can be two cases. Let's say if something is rejected and it does not, like if something is rejected and it is not an Ruko marker, then there is one case. There can also be a case like we detect some Ruko marker, but the contrast between bits is not so much that we are not able to identify like what is its ID. Then in that case also it will be rejected. Now this will contain the Ruko markers which are rejected. So what this function will give us is it will give us three things: corners, the corner of the Ruko markers in the images, the IDs or the IDs of these ArUco markers, which will be identified according to the set bits in them, and the rejected ArUco markers. As I said, there can be two cases, and even more cases, but these two will generally be the cases. Now you can see there is a try except box here. This is basically done so that if some error is there, it can be handled. Now, once we do this, we store our results in a data structure like something called results basically. In results, we will be storing these four things: image path or the path of the image which I supplied in which I detected these things, corners, as I have explained, the corners of the RUCO markers detected, and IDs, the identified ID of the RUCO marker. There is something called poses also, which you will be understanding in the further parts of the code. So let's move ahead. Now you can see an if statement if id is not none and length of index is greater than 0. Basically, we are just checking if like some Eruko marker is detected, then IDs list will there will be some element in the list IDs and length of IDs is greater than 0. Then you can see a function called something called rvex comma tvex. Now these rvex and tvex are rotation vector and translation vector, and these are find out using the cv2.eruco.estimate pose function. Now, what it takes in it in parameters are corners, marker size, camera matrix, and distance coefficients. Now, the first two things we have already seen: corners, which will be directed to the above function, and marker size, which we either input as parameter or we take the default marker size in the init function. Now, these two things, camera matrix and distance coefficients, will not matter much to us right now because we are not dealing with the real hardware. But in real hardware, these are very necessary because this estimation basically depends on the focal length and other parameters of camera. So if any of these things are not properly calibrated, the pose estimation will be wrong and our purpose of Heruko marker will not be fulfilled. So currently what we have done is we identified the Heruko markers, we got their IDs, and now what we are doing with the Heruko markers is we will be identifying their poses. Like we know this is the identity of robot. Okay, now we need the pose on how we are going on where the robot is. So this pose identification is again done using a built-in function, the estimate pose single markers function, as you can see here. And then I supply the desired parameters and I get the rotation vector and translation vector. Then you can see the code here. The code below is just the simple code in which I will be translating the coordinates and rotating the coordinates. Like roll pitch choice found using the rotation vectors, and x, y, z of the markers found using the translation vectors. These are stored in pose info, and accordingly the results, like as you can see in the results, the poses, the IDs, and image path, everything of the markers are stored. So what this function, like data iter function, does is takes an image, uh, first of all extracts from the image the corners IDs of the RUCO markers, of which out of the valid RUCO markers it identified the rotation vectors and translation vectors for them. Then accordingly find out the coordinates of the center and the roll pitch of that RUCO marker and stored them in a results. Results you can say is basically a dictionary, like a Python dictionary only, and it will be storing different things like different things which we detected in our image or different Eruco markers which we detected in our image. Now there is a helper function here, rotation matrix to Euler angles. You don't need to get into the exact derivation of this or how we are converting. You can just say like this is a function which will be extracting the Euler angles or the Euler roll pitch wave from the rotation matrix, and this are basically used to store the results of the Eruco marker. There's another helper function here called draw axis manual. This is an optional function. This is basically just added so that we can visualize the Eruco markers on the image. Again, another visual detection function. Again, this function can be skipped, but if you want to understand, let's say first of all it takes some image as the parameter, or in this case only our image on which we detect our Ruko markers. Then it check if like if we have found some Ruko markers, like if results IDs is not none. In that it will be identifying the corners, drawing a rectangle, or practically it will be square around the Ruko marker, and then it will be drawing the axis and also will be labeling roll pitch and yaw in the form of a text. Now there is another function, process image in folder. So what this code does is it takes batch in the all the batch of images. So all we need to just do is like add all images in our folder. It will automatically like take this image one by one and it will be annotating in it on it accordingly the Eruco marker ID, the current roll pitch and yaw, and it will be also drawing the axis on it. So let's do a quick review of code once again. So we defined an ArUco detector class. The main function, first we defined the init function. It takes in marker size, which is a very important parameter. Another important parameters are camera matrix and distance coefficient. But since we are not on a real robot, this will not be very much important to us. Then we need to define these four parameters: adaptive threshold, window size minimum and maximum, and marker perimeter rate, and marker max min marker perimeter rate, and max marker perimeter rate. This we will learn when we will be getting insight on how these two functions called ArUco detector function and the function to give us the rotation vector and translation vector basically works. Now coming to the important part of our class, the detect marker function. Basically it takes in the image as the parameter and accordingly detect, like, converts the image to grayscale and detect corners and IDs of the RUCO marker, then supply that to the another function which will be providing us the rotation vector and translation vector. Now we store all these results in a dictionary and then we return these results. Now these are the helper functions accordingly to help us, like, convert the rotation vectors to real angles and drawing the axis on our image. And then these things will be drawn on the image accordingly, and we will be able to identify, like, which is our Aruco marker, what is its ID, and what is its current pose, like current roll picture and current XYZ. So now, as we have seen the basic implementation of the function, though these all these things will work very perfectly, but we can't understand, like, how these are working internally. So now let's get to the internal working on how these two functions basically identify the corners and IDs of a Ruko marker, and how we are going to get the rotation vector and translation vector. Again, like, we will not be going into much detail on getting the rotation vector and translation vector, as it is a complicated thing, but we will be trying to, like, basically go through all the algorithms that are happening inside so that we can also write these functions from scratch if we want. Now let's see the steps involved in directing these Aruco markers. So first of all, this is the camera calibration parameter, as and I have said, this will mostly be required when we will be dealing with the real robots. So we can skip that. The second step is image acquisition. In our case, this is done by supplying the image path in our code basically, or as we keep all the images in the same folder, the code will take that image and it will supply these. Now, the third important step, or what we have done in our OpenCV code also, is we convert our image to black and to grayscale image. Now, this is done basically so that it will be easier to identify the black and white squares, and this is done according to the formula as shown here. Another important conversion is adaptive thresholding. Now, even though we have converted our image to grayscale, there may be some issue, like the intensity of light at some place is not the same in the other parts of the image. In order to solve that, we use something called adaptive thresholding. Now, to understand this, I can show you basically the simple procedure. This basically adaptive thresholding takes a window size. In this window, an average is calculated out. Then, accordingly, the pixels of the windows are analyzed, and accordingly, if the value is above a certain threshold, we assign the same value to the entire window. This is basically done. So now it will be easier for us to identify which scores are shaded according to which color, and then we can identify the set bits, and accordingly we can identify our Aruco tag ID and associated details with it. So you can see, like, this is the formula. If the calculated value of the pixels which are shaded are greater than the adaptive threshold, then we assign all the pixels in that window the same value and zero otherwise. So now in our image, what basically we have done is we have converted it to grayscale according to this formula, and then using adaptive thresholding, we have made a way to properly distinguish between black and white squares. Now comes another part. Since we have done this, now we need to know contour detection. This contour detection is basically done to divide our Aruco tag into grids so that accordingly we can count which bits are set and which are not set. This contour detection is done through this algorithm, the algorithm name I have stated. Basically, I will not be going to the details of the algorithm as this is a slightly complex thing. Another important step after contour detection is polygonal approximation. Now, why this is needed? Let's say we have a very complicated curve, but we can always use some polygon to approximate it. This is basically necessary because let's say we have some rectangle which is like bulged out or some other shape, but in order to properly identify the corners, we need a perfect polygon around our ArUco tag. So this is done using a very good algorithm, very like an algorithm called Douglas spectral algorithm. We can avoid going into the deep details of it, but basically what it does is it takes draws some line segment to the curve in order to ensure that the perpendicular distance of every point in that region from that line segment is less than some threshold value, or that value is in arc is epsilon. So these are the main steps that are required to process the image to make the detection easier. The steps are grayscale conversion, convert the image to grayscale, adaptive thresholding so that it will be easier to distinguish between white and black squares, contour detection so that we can draw the grid on the Aruco tag. And there is a very important thing after contour detection that we always neglect the neglect the first layer in the Aruco boundary. This we have also seen in the Aruco tag generation. Like there is an offset layer, we always avoid that offset layer and then only count our bits. Then polygonal approximation so that we can properly demarcate our the boundary of Aruco tag. Again, is done using Douglas Baker algorithm, and in this algorithm we draw a line segment in curves such that the perpendicular distance to every point in that region is less than epsilon or our desired threshold. After all these things are done, we need to do candidate filtering. Let's say we find some find some squares in which the area is very small. Then it is clear indication that this is some accidental detection and it should not be included in Aruco tag. So we only first of all keep the polygons which have at least with have four vertices that are quadrilaterals. Then using the area thresholding, we can filter out like which may have Aruco tags which may not have, and we also use the convexity check. We can get a concave polygon in some cases, and it is guaranteed that this polygon will not give us the desired result. So we do the convexity check. Now these are the seven steps that are implemented inside the Aruco detector function that we directly used in our previous code. But these are not the only things that are there. These are some of the basic things that are there, and these are used to basically detect the Aruco tag. In order, if you want to study more about these things, there is a very good Medium article about it. I will be attaching the link also, which covers everything that I have written here in detail. And there is also like how we can write our own code from scratch to detect the Ruko marker. So using these steps, we are able to detect the Aruco marker. Another important thing is the pose estimation of the Aruco markers. But in order to cover that, we first need to know about transforms. So after we will cover the transforms lecture, we will be studying about that also, like how this pose estimation is done and how we are using camera to identify the pose of basically the robot and all these things. So we have here covered one of the functions, that is the Ruko detector function, like what is internally happening, not in detail, but a basic overview of what all is done inside the function. And again, this is the Medium article which I will be attaching also. Now, since we have done all this, we can now use our Ruko tag on a robot. Now we will be seeing a demonstration on how we will be using this on the robot. Now let's see this basic video on how Aruco markers are used in different tasks for robots. First of all, Aruco markers are not always attached on robots only. We can attach them to different places for which we want an ID, and for which we want to know the estimation of its pose from the world frame. So as you can see in this here also, the Ruko markers are placed at different places. This can be used so that the robot can be guided on where it has to move. Also in a warehouse, a Ruko markers can be placed on a box, and now we know the idea of the box and the relative pose of the box. So a robotic arm or other manipulator can pick that box accordingly and place it. As you can see, there is a very important thing happening in this RVS window. This thing is like the center of the Arugo frame is translated with respect to the world frame. This is done by first estimating the pose of the Aruco marker to camera and then translating this pose using the camera pose, which will be known to us as cameras are mostly fixed in a workspace. Then this pose is translated back to the world frame, and as a result, we know the pose of the ArUco marker with respect to the world frame. So this is one of the application of ArUco markers. We will be covering more application of the ArUco markers as we will be proceeding further. So as we have seen a practical use of ArUco markers, we come to the last part of our lecture, which is something called Hamming distance. So as you can see, I have opened this documentation which contains the ArUco marker dictionary and something called minimum Hamming distance between marker bits. So first of all, let's see what is Hamming distance. So Hamming distance is basically the number of bits that are different between the two given binary strings. So let's say, for example, let's understand this Hamming distance through an example. So this is an example of Hamming distance. Hamming distance between two binary strings is basically the number of bits which differ in the two binary strings. Like for example, you can see in A and B, these are the three different bits, so we can say Hamming distance is 3. Now let's go back to the documentation again. You can see there's something called minimum Hamming distance between the bits. So what it says is, like, if we have some ArUco markers and there are these many markers in the family, then the minimum Hamming distance between the marker bits is 6. Now how it helps us? Let's say we detect some ArUco markers and we say these bits are set in these ArUco markers, and that we can find with the algorithms that we studied previously, or to the directly the ROCO detector code. Now, once we have these set bits, we check how many of these set bits differ from all of the, like, we calculate basically the Hamming distance between our calculated set bits from the RUCO marker that we detected and from the present RUCO markers in the family. Once we have found this, we check if this is less than a threshold, and this threshold is basically this number only. Like, if this is less than this threshold, it is guaranteed that this RUCO markers must be of that identity only through which we have seen it in our family. Like, it might become confusing, so let's understand through an example. Let's say in our RUCO markers, the set bits differ 3 from a marker of identity 50, and from other markers the distance is very large, or like distance is greater than 7 or 8, like something like that. And it, by distance here I mean Hamming distance. Now if this Hamming distance is, let's say, 3 between that ArUco marker of ID 50 and our ArUco marker, you can say with guarantee that this is the ArUco marker of identity 50 only, because the minimum Hamming distance will be 6 between two ArUco markers. So if it closely resembles some ArUco markers and the Hamming distance is less than that threshold, we can say with guarantee that this ArUco marker has that identity only. That's why ArUco markers are very prone to error, because we generate ArUco markers with an algorithm such that the Hamming distance is large between two ArUco markers, and for analysis also we make sure that the Hamming distance between our detected ArUco marker and some ArUco marker of family is appropriately chosen, so that we can guarantee that this marker is of that identity only. With that, we complete our lecture on ArUco markers. In the further lecture, when we will be studying about transforms, we will be using ArUco markers to transform the coordinates of an object in our workspace with the world frame, or to transform the coordinates of what in the workspace.